Hi everyone, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and with this video we are going to start the series of the analysis of the games that were submitted by our users. So in this particular one we are going to analyze a game that was submitted by the user Ashismagnus. So in this game you played with black pieces and your opponent started with a d4, and after d5, c4, you responded with the knight to f6 move. First of all, I guess if you play Queen's Gambit declined, because on the next move you have played e6 move, which in my opinion shows the intention of playing the Queen's Gambit declined. I guess the move order matters, and it's actually better to start with the e6 move here. So instead of playing knight f6, you just play e6, immediately supporting your central d5 pawn. The difference being that after knight to f6 and, for example, c captures d5, the move that your opponent didn't make. So here, as you can see, you have to recapture with the piece on d5, which means you lose a control over the central squares. Let's say if knight takes on d5, white may continue with the e4, already grabbing the control over the central squares. As you may notice, d5 and e5 are under control, and it is a tempo move at the same time, so now you have to spend a move or two to bring the knight to a better position. Now it's a problem because on b6 there is nothing to do. If knight goes to something like f6, well, it's also a big question. White may use that position of the knight later, just pushing pawns in the center. All right, so that's the first thing that I would have changed in your play. So simply e6 instead of knight to f6, or c6 if you want to play Slav. So your opponent didn't use that opportunity and play knight to c3. Of course, in this case, after e6, the game was back on track of the normal Queen's Gambit declined. And after knight to f3, you decided to capture on c4. So I believe that it is a playable stuff, but again, it doesn't look very consistent to me. So you either play Queen's Gambit declined or you play Queen's Gambit accepted, right? And if you want to play Queen's Gambit accepted, probably it's a good idea to make this decision a bit earlier. So already here, after c4, you capture on c4. Now, since your knight is still on g8, you have additional options. For example, you don't have to spend the next move on playing knight to f6. So it depends on what white is doing here, obviously, but in some lines, you can play e5 or say c5, undermining the pawn, immediately fighting for central squares. By the way, you can check our series on a YouTube channel dedicated to Queen's Gambit accepted if you're interested in this direction. So here, when you captured on c4, I believe that, well, it is still a playable move, no questions. But now, as you can see, white has slightly better chances to attack your pawn immediately. White controls a bit more squares. You have already played e6, so you don't have these possibilities with e5 and c5 that you have when you take the pawn on the second move. Anyway, it is a valid option, although I would recommend it to do something like bishop to e7. So just playing Queen's Gambit declined. All right, after d takes c4 and e3, c4 is under attack, and white is definitely going to take that pawn. You cannot really keep that pawn, so this pawn drops next move, whatever you do. But you can be prepared for it. And once again, just like in Queen's Gambit accepted, you should understand that whenever you give up a center like this, when you exchange your central pawn, giving your opponent a slight central advantage, like here you may notice white has two pawns and you have only one, which means that long term white will be better in the center. Your natural strategy should definitely include undermining activity of this center. So you should want to get rid of opponent's central pawn d4 in this particular case. Your plan should be somehow dedicated to undermining this pawn with a c7, c5. In the nearest future or a bit later, it depends. But that definitely should be a part of your strategy here. So how to do that? There are different methods, so probably you can even consider immediate c5 move here. But again, pretty much in the spirit of Queen's Gambit accepted is the move a6. So the point is, you kind of create a threat of just playing b7, b5 here, keeping the pawn on the board. And if white captures the pawn, and I think it's the most logical move here, then you may consider something like b7, b5, a tempo move, which solves another problem of your setup, namely the activity of your light squared bishop. So whenever you play Queen's Gambit with the pawn on e6, you may experience this situation that your bishop has no good squares for a long time, and this is part of your strategy as well. So undermining the d4 pawn, solving the problem of the light squared bishop. Yeah, if you succeed in it, then you solve your problems and equalize comfortably. And here, as you can see, you're quite close to completing the development of the queen side, at the same time preparing c5. So what you need to do here is either playing c5 in the nearest future, or maybe doing this after some preparation with a knight to d7. And I think you should be fine. After all, something typical for Queen's Gambit accepted should happen on the board, in my opinion. Instead, you played, in my opinion, a dubious move, bishop to b4. So yes, it is a development of the piece. You pin the knight and hence fight for central squares d5 and e4. It's pretty much in the spirit of Nimzo-Indian defense. But the thing is, the situation in the center is different. So you have already played d5 and d takes c4, which makes it not really comparable to Nimzo-Indian defense. That's why I don't like this bishop b4. In many cases, it becomes a target. And in this particular case, I wouldn't actually exchange my bishop for the knight, because it gives your opponent a pair of bishops advantage in a position which is not that closed, which is just a natural result of d5 and d5 takes c4. So your opponent responded with a very simple bishop captures on c4, and as you can see, after castling and castling, you still have problems with the development, but now you have a new problem. The bishop on b4, which is vulnerable. So if you want to play c5, and we have discussed already that it is a part of your strategy here to get rid of opponent's central pawn d4, to try to exchange it. So it's much better to do when your bishop is not on e7, not on b4, because here, just imagine you play something like c5, then opponent plays a3, and it's already quite awkward, because you either take on c3, which is not good because you just help your opponent strengthen the center and yeah, give your opponent a pair of bishops, or you have to go away with the bishop and you lose the pawn on c5. So that's why if you want to play c5, it's better to do that when the bishop is on e7, and that's why I don't like bishop b4 idea. So what I would have played in this particular position, probably something like b6. I know it looks a bit ugly, and most likely black will have to spend additional tempi to bring the bishop back to either d6 or e7, but I think it's the lesser evil here. At least we're trying to solve another problem, which is the activity of the light squared bishop. So here we want to play something like bishop b7, and at some point bishop goes back from b4 to d6 or e7, and then finally c5. So back on track, in other words. So you played bishop to d7. In my opinion, this is the main reason of your complications in this game. And to be completely honest, you're not really improving your bishop this way. So yes, you change the initial position to this one on d7, but bishop doesn't get any better because of it. And this square is, you know, a much better one for the knight, I would say, supporting c5. So here, for example, white may have played something simple like knight e5, and it's already quite ugly because although this bishop is not very active, it's a very important defender of light squares. And if you lose it after, say, knight c6 and knight to d7, well, it looks like it's a great thing for black because black is actually completing the development because of white's actions. But the long-term consequences are not so good because now white controls light squares all around the board, with the help of the light square bishop, white may attack those squares, and black has serious problems. So whenever black thinks of something like e5 later, it will open the position and will weaken light squares even more. So I would recommend you to check the topic of pair of bishops and why it's important, why it is an advantage, why it is a serious advantage sometimes, and how it works in open positions for more information. So here, black deals exactly with this problem, in my opinion. So another interesting moment, your opponent played, instead of playing knight e5, your opponent played bishop to d2, which is also not bad, to be honest. So it's just a normal move. It just doesn't look very ambitious to me. That's why I would have tried something like knight to e5. And you captured on c3. So that is another sign that you don't quite understand what's going on here, because you voluntarily exchange your bishop for the knight in a position where it, first of all, wasn't forced. Second, you don't really get anything as a proper compensation for missing bishop. So important thing to understand that whenever you give your opponent an advantage of this kind, so pair of bishops, you need a specific compensation for it. Let's say your opponent has some concrete weaknesses because of this exchange, or your opponent has a back keen that you can easily attack. So literally anything that compensates a missing bishop, because a bishop is a perfect defender of the squares of a certain color. So if there is no bishop of this color on the board and the opponent has the one, it's clear that your opponent has much better chances to organize an attack using those squares, for example. Maybe a strategic attack, maybe just an attack against your king, doesn't matter. So once you lose a bishop, you kind of lose a control over at least one part of the board. I would say it's 50%, roughly. So that's the thing, that's the problem. And in this particular case, I just don't see compensation for it. So I don't see weaknesses in white's camp. I don't see what you are getting because of this exchange on c3. Nothing, literally. So it's a great help to your opponent. And the next move, c6, is another serious mistake. Because in this case, again, you're not achieving anything because of it, because your opponent probably didn't want to play d5 immediately here. So c6 cannot be considered a move against d5. You make your bishop super passive on d7. Now it's completely limited with own pawns. And you weaken dark squares even more. Because, you know, after bishop c3 and bishop c3, exactly the dark square complex is a problem for you. And now you make a pawn move, placing another pawn on light square, which weakens the control over, let's say, d6. So the most critical weakening is the d6 at the moment. So another important thing, whenever you exchange your bishop for the knight, you should try to compensate the absence of the bishop with the right pawn placement. In many cases, it means that if you, for example, exchange a dark squared bishop, you have to try to put your pawns in dark squares. And the same is about light squared bishop. If there is no light squared bishop, try to put your pawns on light squares. So in this particular case, the dark squared bishop is absent. So you have to try to put as many pawns on dark squares as possible to compensate its absence, just to control those squares that the bishop can no longer protect. And as you can see, c6 just violates this principle, right? And no questions, white has a serious advantage now. There are multiple ways for white to increase pressure. You have no compensation for bishops, you have no compensation for white's better presence in the center here. There is no counterplay and your pieces are misplaced. So the later play demonstrates also the absence of clear understanding of the concept of, you know, a weakness. So, for example, b5 weakens a lot and it's just a pseudo-active move. In fact, you're attacking the bishop, but it's just a one-move threat. It's easy for white to just go away with the bishop, but the weakness of c5 square that you have created by this b5 is here forever. So your opponent will use it. You have weakened also the pawn on c6. It's also forever here. It's not that hard for white to prevent you from playing something like c5, so that will be definitely a target for white. and it is on the open file, so the attack will be really simple against this weakness. So a5, again, you're just grabbing some space there, but it's nothing. You're not really attacking anything. So you put your pawns here on b4 and a5, but they're really deep in the opponent's camp and can be used as a target as well. So they're not well supported by pieces from behind, and they're not really attacking anything, so it's just a pseudo activity. So you attacked several pieces, but they were mainly one-move threats, not more than that. And no surprises, your opponent in the nearest future starts the undermining activity. Now after b takes a3, he could have considered something like rook captures on a3 with further attack against a5, another weakness you have created yourself. But your opponent decided to capture with the pawn, which is also not bad. And somewhere around this moment we can probably stop, because it's clear that white has just a decisive positional advantage here. Once again, pair of bishops, great presence in the center, amazing outpost for the knight on e5, this weakness on c6, this weakness on a5. So there are no weaknesses in white's camp at all, so you don't have real counterplay here. Your pieces are misplaced. Some of them are not developed yet. Some of them occupy terrible positions like bishop on e8. So everything is already decided here, in fact. And yeah, of course, you made several more moves, and then at some point you started losing your pieces one by one. So actually, you may think that the problem of losing this game was in blunder in some stuff, but it's not that. In fact, the position was already decided earlier. So this is just a result of terrible weakening of the position that you committed yourself. So I would stop here with the analysis, and I would say that there are a few recommendations that I've already given to you during the game. I want to add to that that in general you should rethink your attitude to the center and central squares, the way you play in the center in general and in the opening in particular. For that, I would also recommend some videos on the platform of Chessfactor dedicated to the center, as well as some books for beginner players. For example, pay attention to the series of Artur Yusupov. I think it's a great one. So it is dedicated to players of different levels, and I believe you can benefit from thoroughly reading it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and see you next videos.